In the autumn of 1878, in the high country east of the San Juan Mountains in Colorado Territory, a woman named Clara Finch paid $3.40 for a broken bronze cannon that no one else would touch. The men gathered at the Ridgecrest impound lot that Tuesday morning found this funny. The cannon had sat on the exposed granite shelf above the Teller Road for 11 years, planted there as a monument by a mining company that had since dissolved, left to the weather and the indifferent sky. The barrel was split at the muzzle end, a crack running a handspan down the metal, and the carriage had long since rotted away. What remained was 600 pounds of green tarnished bronze, cracked and tilted on the bare stone, and nobody had seen a reason to move it. The county impound agent said so plainly when Clara raised her card. He said it again when she signed the bill of sale. He said it a third time to the men standing behind her. And those men laughed in the way men laugh when they think they are being kind. She did not answer any of them. If you have ever watched a person buy a thing everyone else called worthless, and then watch that person prove them all wrong in the slowest, most deliberate way imaginable, then you know how this story ends. If you have not, then stay close. This one is worth your full attention. Clara Finch was 27 years old that October. She had come to Ridgecrest from the San Luis Valley the previous spring, carrying a canvas satchel, a short-handled bronze-working mallet her father had cast himself, and the knowledge of metal that her father had spent 17 years placing in her hands. Owen Finch had been a bell founder's apprentice before he was a frontierman, and he had raised Clara the way some fathers raise a son, which is to say he had raised her to be useful. He had taught her to read the color of heated metal, to feel the difference between a pour that had gone right and one that had gone wrong, to listen to what a cracked casting told you about the moment and the conditions of its failure. He had died of a fever the previous winter, leaving Clara the mallet, the knowledge, and $43, which was enough to get her to Ridgecrest and not much more. She had taken work where she found it. She repaired a broken church bell in April and cast 2 new plow points for a wheat farmer in May. She mended a cracked iron flywheel at the mill on Cottonwood Creek in June and recast a broken axle fitting for a freight wagon in July. She was good at this work, and the town of Ridgecrest was slowly, in the cautious way of small towns, beginning to admit it. She had rented a corner of the smithy near the livery on 3rd Street, and the smith, a square-built man named Ray Trout, who had 4 fingers on his right hand and a low opinion of most people, had told her in August that she was welcome to stay through winter. It was Ray Trout who first told her about the cannon. He had mentioned it the way a person mentions something they consider amusing, something they expect you to find amusing too. There was an old piece up on the ridge, he said. Cracked bronze, 600 pounds at least, nobody wanting it. County was going to auction it for scrap weight, though nobody had figured out how to get it down. Clara had asked 2 questions which Ray Trout could not answer. She wanted to know the cannon's original maker and what year it had been mounted. Ray Trout did not know. She had gone up to the ridge that same afternoon to look. What she found was not simply a broken monument. She saw that the instant she crouched beside it. The cannon was a 3-inch bore-field piece, mid-century manufacture, and the crack at the muzzle was not the result of impact or misuse. It was a cold crack, the kind that happened when metal cooled too fast, or when the alloy contained impurities that had contracted unevenly over many years of freeze and thaw. Her father had shown her cold cracks in 2 rejected bells during her childhood. The shape was unmistakable. The crack was wide at the muzzle and tapered toward the trunnion end, and it had not propagated further in years, which meant the metal was otherwise sound. She pressed her thumb into the crack's widest point and felt the edge. Clean metal on both sides, not corroded through. The taper told her the flaw had originated at the muzzle face and run inward, stopping when it reached denser material lower down the casting. A cold crack running that direction in that taper was the result of the muzzle cooling faster than the body during the original pour, years or decades before the piece was mounted here. Not an accident of weather. A defect present from manufacture, one that had traveled slowly over the years of freeze and thaw until the thinning at the muzzle had let it open. The cannon had never exploded. It had never been fired on this ridge. It had been placed here, she thought, because it was already cracked. A monument that was already worthless, mounted to look like a monument and left. That was not what held her attention in the end. What held her attention was the breech end of the barrel. On a standard field cannon of this period, the breech plug was a fixed casting, sealed with the barrel in a single pour. On this cannon, the breech plug showed a seam, a fine one, nearly invisible under the tarnish, running in a clean circle around the plug's base. Someone had machined a threaded breech plug into this barrel after the original casting. It was the work of a skilled machinist, and it had been done deliberately, and it had been sealed over with a chemical patina that had darkened to match the surrounding bronze. A person who did not know what they were looking for would never have found it. Clara Finch ran her thumb around the seam and said nothing for a long moment. The auction was 3 days later. She went. The county impound agent's name was Burl Marsh, and he was a man who wore his certainties the way some men wear their hats, pulled down firmly and not easily removed. He read out the lot description in a voice that communicated his opinion of the whole business without actually saying it. 600-pound bronze cannon, cracked muzzle, no carriage, granite mount, Teller Road Ridge. Starting bid 50 cents for scrap weight, since nobody expected it to move under its own power or anyone else's. 2 men bid against Clara, both of them apparently moved by some combination of civic spirit and the desire to keep a woman from winning an auction. They stopped at $2.80. She bid $3.40, and they let her have it. The laughter, when it came, was not cruel exactly. It was the laughter of people who believe they understand the situation completely, who are certain the joke is on someone else. Burl Marsh told her while writing out the bill of sale that she had just bought herself a problem that weighed more than most horses. She told him she was aware of the weight. He asked her how she planned to move it. She said she would let him know when it was done. She had 3 weeks before the first hard snow closed the Teller Road. The ridge where the cannon sat was accessible by a switchback trail that a determined mule could manage in good weather. Clara hired the use of a mule from the livery for 6 days, borrowed Ray Trout's heaviest draw chains, and spent the better part of a morning talking through the problem with an old man named Ezekiel Har, who lived in a stone cabin at the foot of the ridge trail and who had, in a previous life, moved artillery for the Union Army in the Vicksburg campaign. Ezekiel Har was 71 years old, thin as a fence post, and possessed of opinions about artillery movement that he shared freely and without invitation. He told Clara she was going to kill herself, and the mule both trying to drag 600 pounds of bronze down a switchback trail in October. She said she was not planning to drag it. She planned to roll it, muzzle end first, on a timber cradle. He looked at her for a long time and then said he would help her if she would agree to let him do the thinking for the first half hour. She agreed. He thought for 40 minutes and then admitted her plan was sound. They spent 2 days cutting and shaping the timber cradle on the ridge itself, working in the thin, cold air of 8,000 feet with a crosscut saw and a draw knife, using pine that Ezekiel felled from the slope below the rock shelf. The cradle was a simple rocking frame, 2 curved skids of green pine, notched to hold the cannon's barrel at its trunnion points, with a drag rope rigged to the mule's collar and a brake rope tied off to a cedar tree at each switchback to control the descent. The work was slow and the coal came early each afternoon, the sky going the color of pewter above the spruce line and the temperature dropping 10 degrees in an hour. Ezekiel built a fire at the edge of the rock shelf each evening while the light failed, and they ate what they had brought and said little. He had a way of moving around a fire at altitude that told you he had spent many nights at high elevation, unhurried and low-bodied, keeping his warmth close. He did not ask Clara questions about her history or her plans. He asked only about the work, the weight of the cannon, the grade of the steepest switchback, the thickness of the pine they were shaping. She answered him in the same spare register. On the second evening, he said that the timber cradle was the right idea because the barrel would naturally want to roll, and that wanting to roll was the thing you used, not the thing you fought. She said her father had told her something similar about hot metal in a pour. He said that was probably the same principle. Then they went to sleep. On the third day, they lowered the cannon off the granite shelf onto the cradle, using a block and tackle rigged to a rock anchor that Ezekiel had driven into a crack in the stone with a hand drill and a lot of patience. The cannon rolled onto the skids with a sound like a muffled bell, a deep vibration that traveled through the stone beneath their feet before it settled. The cradle held. Ezekiel said something under his breath that might have been a prayer, or might have been profanity, and Clara checked every knot in the system twice before she spoke. It took the rest of that day and the first half of the following morning to bring the cannon down the trail. The mule, whose name was June and who had the disposition of an experienced professional, pulled at an even pace and responded to the brake ropes without incident. At the two steepest switchbacks, Clara held the upper brake while Ezekiel walked the mule around the turn, and the cradle skidded and groaned and held each time. At the second switchback, the lower skid caught on a root crossing the trail, and the cannon rocked in its frame for a long moment before settling. Neither of them spoke until it was still again. They reached the foot of the trail at midday, the cannon resting in the cradle in the flat rocky ground in front of Ezekiel's cabin, and Clara sat down on a stone and did not speak for several minutes. Ezekiel brought her a cup of coffee. He said quietly that she was either the most capable woman he had ever met or the most stubborn one, and that he was not sure those were different things. She drank the coffee and thanked him for his help. She paid him with 3 days of work at his cabin, recaulking the window frames before winter, resetting a hearthstone that had cracked and tilted, and casting a new latch pin for his front door, which had been fastened with a bent nail for 2 years. He watched her work each of these tasks with the attention of a man who had spent a long life recognizing competence, and he said nothing except what was useful. She hauled the cannon, cradle and all, into Ridgecrest on a borrowed freight wagon 2 days later. People came out to look. Some of them had come out specifically because they had heard she had the cannon and wanted to see whether she had actually managed it. Burl Marsh stood on the boardwalk in front of the county office and watched the wagon pass without expression. She drove it straight to the smithy and unloaded it with Ray Trout's block and tackle, and then she told Ray Trout she would need the forge to herself for several days, and she would explain later. He gave her the forge. He asked no questions. He had, in the months since her arrival, learned that questions before the work was finished were not particularly productive. Now, there is a thing about bronze that the men who had laughed at Clara's purchase did not know, and that most people have no reason to know. Bronze does not behave the way iron does under heat. It is an alloy, copper and tin in careful proportion, and when it is heated and worked, it reads differently than iron reads. It responds to the hammer differently, and it can be repaired in ways that a cracked iron casting cannot. Clara's father had taught her this over many hours at a small furnace in the San Luis Valley, working with broken bells and miscast fittings, learning to hear what the metal wanted to tell her. The repair she was considering for the cannon's cracked muzzle was not simple. It required cutting back the crack to clean metal, building a bronze sleeve that would fit over the muzzle end, and brazing the sleeve in place with a filler rod that matched the alloy's composition. She had done similar work on 2 bells. She had never done it on a piece this large. She did not begin the repair immediately. First, she unscrewed the breech plug. She had brought up from the ridge a half-pint jar of her father's detarnishing solution, a careful mixture of weak acid and salt that he had used to reveal the true color of old castings. She worked it into the seam around the breech plug with a small brush, let it sit for an hour, then wiped it clean. The seam clarified and she could see the thread pitch now, a coarse left-hand thread, 6 turns per inch. She made a wrench from a bar of iron stock, filing the jaws to fit the plug's flats. This took most of the first afternoon. The plug's outer face was an octagonal casting, and the tolerances were tight, the work of someone who had known what they were doing and had not wanted the wrench to fit anything but the right tool. She filed the jaws to within a 64th of an inch and tested the fit 3 times before she was satisfied. She applied the wrench the following morning after the forge had warmed the metal slightly. The first attempt moved nothing. The second produced a sound from deep in the thread that told her the mineral deposit was beginning to break. She released pressure, applied more of the solution to the seam, waited another quarter of an hour, and tried again. The plug turned on the 3rd attempt. It had been in place for years, and the thread had accumulated mineral deposits from the weather. But the threads themselves were sound. The plug turned, resisting, then giving, a quarter turn and then another, and she unscrewed it the remaining distance by hand. It came free with a soft give, like the seal of a jar that has been shut a very long time. A smell came out with it. Old air, sealed air, carrying the ghost of oil that had long since stiffened in the cold. What she removed from inside the breech chamber took a moment to comprehend. The chamber had been sealed before the plug was installed. Whoever had machined the threads and fitted the plug had packed the interior with a wrapping of oilcloth, and inside the oilcloth were 3 folded documents. They had been in there for a very long time. The oilcloth was stiff but intact, and it had done its work. The documents inside were dry. She unfolded them with the care of a person who understood that she was handling something that had been kept safe at considerable effort by someone who was no longer here to explain why. The first document was a survey plat. It was dated September of 1861 and bore the seal of the Colorado Territorial Survey Office. It described a section of land in the Teller Creek watershed, 480 acres of mixed timber and graze at the upper elevation, with a spring-fed meadow at the center described in precise compass bearings and chain measurements. The second document was a land grant certificate. It was issued by the Territorial Land Office in Denver City and signed by the Deputy Land Commissioner. It conveyed the 480 acres described in the survey to a man named Hector Vidal and his wife, Luz Vidal, of San Luis, Colorado Territory, in fee simple. The date was October of 1861. The third document was a letter in Spanish, written in a careful hand. Clara could read enough Spanish to work out its substance. It was addressed to a daughter. It explained that the grant papers had been placed in the cannon for safekeeping during a period of difficulty, when the writer feared the documents might be taken or destroyed. He had trusted the cannon because it was heavy and old, and nobody wanted it, and he had expected to return for it within months. The letter did not say why he had not returned. It was signed at the bottom with the name Hector. She set the 3 documents on the workbench and looked at them for a long time. The Teller Creek watershed. She knew the name. Everybody in Ridgecrest knew the name. The Teller Creek land was held by a timber company called the Hartwell Timber and Grazing Concern. which had been incorporated in Denver in 1869 and which controlled several thousand acres in the upper watershed. The Hartwell concern's principal agent in Ridgecrest was a man named Preston Cole, who maintained an office on the main street and who wore good suits and kept polished boots and was generally regarded as a man of substance. The Hartwell concern had been harvesting timber from that watershed for nearly a decade. They paid their fees to the county and their taxes to the territory, and no one had raised a question about their title. The grant certificate in Clara's hands was dated 8 years before the Hartwell concern's incorporation. She did not move quickly after that. Quick movement was not what the situation required. What it required was the same patience and attention that had brought the cannon down the mountain. She spent 2 days in the county records office, working through the land title registry with the quiet persistence of someone who knows what they are looking for. The clerk, a young man named Douglas who wore spectacles and was mildly alarmed by her presence, offered to help after an hour and became genuinely useful by the afternoon of the second day. What the record showed was straightforward enough once Douglas found the right registry pages. The Hartwell concern's title to the Teller Creek land traced back to a conveyance recorded in 1869 from a previous holder named the Summit Creek Land and Grazing Company. The Summit Creek Company's title, in turn, traced to a conveyance in 1866 from a private seller named T. Marsh. The initial entry in the registry for that land showed no record of any prior grant or claim. The 480-acre Vidal grant had simply never been entered. Douglas said, looking at the pages, that this was irregular. Clara said it was more than irregular. She asked him whether the original survey plat for that section had been filed with the county. He looked. It had not. She thanked Douglas and left the records office and walked to the other end of town to find Ezekiel Hare, who had come in from his ridge cabin for supplies and who was sitting in front of the dry goods store drinking coffee from a tin cup and watching the street with the relaxed attention of a man who has nowhere urgently to be. She sat down beside him and told him what she had found. She did not dramatize it. She described the documents, the grant date, the name on the certificate, and what the records did and did not show. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set down the tin cup and was quiet for a moment. He said he had known a family named Vidal. He had known them in the early days of the territory, before the war, when several Mexican and Spanish land grant families were trying to establish themselves in the upper San Juan country. He did not know what had become of the Vidals. He knew the land they had settled because he had ridden through it once and remarked to himself what fine meadow country it was. He said Clara should find a territorial land attorney before she did anything else. The territorial land attorney whose name Ezekiel recommended was a woman named Dorothea Penn, who practiced in the town of Alamosa and who had, in the course of her career, argued 3 land grant cases before the territorial court. She was not easy to get to in October, with the mountain passes tightening. Clara went anyway, taking the southbound stage to the end of the line and riding the remaining 12 miles on a hired horse in one long, cold day. Dorothea Penn was 53 years old, with gray-streaked hair and the manner of someone who has heard many stories and is rarely surprised by them. She listened to Clara's account without interruption, examined the 3 documents with a magnifying glass she kept on her desk for exactly this purpose, and then spent 20 minutes with her own copies of the Territorial Land Registry Digest before saying anything further. She asked 3 questions during that time. She asked what the cannon's original mounting date had been, and Clara said she did not know precisely, only that the mining company had placed it approximately 11 years before the auction. Dorothea Penn wrote this down. She asked whether any portion of the oilcloth wrapping had deteriorated, and Clara said the outer layer had stiffened, but the inner had held. Dorothea Penn said that was consistent with a packing done in the early 1860s, when the oilcloth available in the territory was of a heavier weight than what came later. She asked, last, whether Hector Vidal's letter named the nature of the difficulty that had made him hide the documents. Clara said it did not, only that he had feared the papers might be taken or destroyed. Dorothea Penn said that was the most important sentence in the letter, and she underlined it on her own notes. What she said then was that the documents appeared genuine. The survey plat's seal and format were consistent with 1861 territorial practice. The grant certificate's language was standard for that office and period. The T-Marsh, whose name appeared in the 1866 conveyance, was, in her opinion, a matter that would interest a court, given that Burl Marsh was the son of a man who had died in Ridgecrest in 1872 and who had gone by the name Thomas Marsh and who had worked as a county recorder during the 1860s. Clara said she had not made that connection. Dorothea Penn said that was why Clara had come to her. They worked out what came next in practical terms. The original grant certificate and the survey plat would need to be presented to the Territorial Land Office in Denver City, along with a formal petition to have the prior grant registered and its subsequent conveyances examined. The petition would not resolve anything immediately. These things moved slowly. There would likely be a challenge from the Hartwell concern and whatever attorneys they retained. The process would take time, and its outcome was not certain, though the documents were clear. Clara asked whether there was a Vidal family anywhere that could be found. Dorothea Penn said she would make inquiries through the Alamosa Court Registry and through contacts she had in the San Luis Valley. She had reason to believe that some members of the family had remained in the territory. She said this with a measured directness that suggested she was not speculating. Clara returned to Ridgecrest in the last week of October, the day before the first true snow came to the high country. She finished the cannon's repair during the first week of November, working in the forge while the snow accumulated outside. The muzzle sleeve required 3 days of preparation before the casting could begin. She cut back the crack with a cold chisel and a fine file, working to clean metal on both faces of the flaw, removing the tarnished and marginally corroded material until she reached bronze that showed its true color under the file. The cut measured 11 inches down the barrel face when she was done, wider than the original crack by half an inch on each side, and the sides of the cut were clean and parallel. She measured the outside diameter of the muzzle at 4 points around its circumference and averaged the figures, then added the sleeve thickness and built her casting mold from that number. The muzzle sleeve she cast from reclaimed bronze, sourcing scrap material from 2 broken bells in Ray Trout's backlot and a cracked plowshare fitting that a farmer had brought in the previous summer and never returned for. She melted it down in 2 pours to check the alloy, letting the first pour run into a test ingot and examining the color and the grain of the broken face when it cooled. The grain was too coarse, the alloy too rich in tin. She adjusted the mix in the second melt and poured the test ingot again, and the second break showed a finer grain and a color that matched the cannon barrel's own broken edge closely enough to satisfy her. The brazing took 3 more days of careful work, heating the muzzle evenly with a wrapped fire and feeding the filler rod at the precise rate the metal wanted. The trick in brazing bronze was to keep the parent metal and the filler within 10 degrees of each other, which required constant attention to the color of the surface and constant small adjustments to the fire. Clara's father had taught her to read bronze by color, the way a baker reads bread by crust, with a knowledge that was partly visual and partly felt in the hands holding the rod. When she was finished, she ran her hand along the repaired seam and felt it smooth, the sleeve bonded into the parent metal without gap or void. She polished the whole barrel with pumice and oil until the old tarnish was gone and the bronze showed its true color, a deep, warm amber gold that changed in different light. She thought, working the polish into the metal, about what her father had told her once when she was 12 and had cracked a small bell by overheating it. He had told her that metal remembers, that every flaw in a casting is a record of the conditions of its making, and that reading those flaws tells you the true history of the thing, which is not always the history anyone intended to leave. She had been young enough to find this poetic. She was old enough now to understand he had meant it plainly. The cannon was a beautiful piece when she was done with it. She mounted it in a timber carriage she had built herself, a proper garrison-style carriage with iron wheel bands and oak trail, and she positioned it in front of the smithy where it could be seen from the street. People came to look at it. Some of the men who had laughed at the auction came to look at it. She watched them from the forge window and felt nothing that she would have called satisfaction, because the cannon was not the point of the work. It had been the container, and what had been inside it was the point. Dorothea Penn sent a letter in late November, informing Clara that she had located a woman named Rosario Mina, born Rosario Vidal, who lived in Antonito in the southern part of the territory and was 62 years old. Rosario Mina was Hector and Luz Vidal's youngest daughter. She had been 3 years old in 1861, and she had no memory of the grant papers or of the cannon, but she had carried her whole life the knowledge that her family had been displaced from land they had legally held, by means she had never been able to document. Dorothea Penn brought Rosario Mina to Ridgecrest in February when the passes reopened. Clara met them at the stage depot on a morning when the temperature had not risen above 20 degrees, and the street was hard frozen mud, and the stage arrived an hour late, and Rosario Mina descended from it with the care of a person whose joints remembered cold from many winters. Clara brought them to the smithy. The forge was lit and the room was warm, and she set the 3 documents on the workbench where she had first unfolded them, in the same order she had unfolded them in, the survey plat first, and the grant certificate second, and the letter third. She explained what each one was. She did not rush the explanation. Dorothea Penn stood slightly to one side and let Clara do the talking, which told Clara something about what kind of person Dorothea Penn was. Rosario Mina was a small woman with white hair and dark eyes, and she looked at the grant certificate for a long time before she touched it. When she did touch it, she laid her hand flat on the paper, the way you lay your hand on something you believed you had lost entirely. She was quiet for longer than felt comfortable. Then she said in English that she had heard the land described by her mother every year of her childhood. 480 acres, mixed timber and graze, a spring-fed meadow at the center. She had heard it described so many times that she had eventually stopped believing the description referred to anything real. She had thought it was the way her mother kept grief, by giving it a geography. She did not weep. She said in English and then in Spanish that her father had been right to trust the cannon. She said this more than once. The petition to the Territorial Land Office was filed in March. The Hartwell concern's attorneys contested it, as Dorothea Penn had predicted, and the matter passed into a process that moved in the unhurried way of legal processes involving land. Preston Cole, in the months that followed, developed a habit of walking on the opposite side of the street from the smithy. He did not speak to Clara. She did not expect him to. The territorial court ruled in the autumn of 1880, 23 months after Clara had unscrewed the breech plug. The ruling was measured and not dramatic in its language, which is the way of such rulings. It found that the Vidal grant of 1861 predated all subsequent conveyances of the described land, and that those conveyances, originating with a conveyance attributed to T-Marsh in 1866, could not be upheld against a prior documented grant. It ordered the Hartwell Timber and Grazing Concern to account for the value of timber extracted from the granted land since 1869. The accounting process, also unhurried, resulted 2 years later in a settlement that Dorothea Penn negotiated on Rosario Mina's behalf, a payment of principal and an agreement regarding the remaining standing timber. Rosario Mina did not return to the Teller Creek land herself. She was 64 by then, and the land was high and demanding. And what she had wanted most of her life was not the land itself, but the record that said it had been hers by right. She used part of the settlement to purchase a house in Antonito. She used another part to establish a small scholarship at the school there for the children of families who could not afford to keep them in school past the primary years. She sent Clara a letter when these things were done. The letter was short and formal and entirely warm, and it included a sentence near the end that Clara kept. It said that her father had hidden the truth in the thing they thought was worthless, because he understood that worthless things are the safest hiding places in the world. In Ridgecrest, the cannon stood in front of the smithy through the winter of 1882 and the spring that followed. Ray Trout told anyone who asked that the metalwork on the muzzle sleeve was the finest brazing repair he had seen in 30 years of working iron. And he said this with the lack of elaboration of a man who means it as the highest possible praise. Ezekiel Haar, who came down from his ridge cabin for supplies each month, would stop in front of it and stand a while before going about his business saying nothing, though he had the look of a man finding something exactly where he expected to find it. Clara kept the breech plug on her workbench. She had cleaned and polished it the way she had cleaned and polished the barrel, and it sat there among her other tools, a small bronze cylinder about the size of a man's fist, threaded on one end, the left-hand thread visible if you held it to the light. People who came into the smithy for work would sometimes pick it up without knowing what it was, feeling the weight of it, turning it over, setting it down again. It was heavier than it looked. Bronze always was. She never explained it unless someone asked directly, and not many people did. The people who knew what it was already knew the story, and the story was the only explanation the plug needed. Ray Trout asked once, early in the spring of 1879, after Clara had told him enough of what had happened to answer the questions he was going to ask eventually. He held the plug for a moment, felt the thread, set it back down. He said it was a fine piece of machining. She said yes. He said the man who made it must have been a careful person. She said that was what she thought too, that whoever had machined this thread had understood they were building something that needed to hold for an unknown number of years, and had built it accordingly. Ray Trout said nothing more about it. He went back to work. The mallet her father had cast still hung on the wall above the forge, the one she had carried from the San Luis Valley. She had not used it for production work. It was too light for most of the jobs she took, and its balance was a foundry man's balance, not a smithy worker's. She kept it there because it was the first tool that had made her understand that a person can know a material the way a person knows another person, by attention and time, and the willingness to be taught. She thought about this on the days the work was slow, in the long, quiet intervals between jobs when the forge ticked and the snow came against the window in the way it comes in high country, sideways and without apology. She thought about her father standing at the furnace in the San Luis Valley, holding a cracked bell against the morning light, turning it slowly to read the flaw. Every crack is a record, he had said. The question is whether you know how to read it. She had paid $3.40 to learn what that crack recorded. The men who had laughed at her for it had received a portion of an answer they had not expected. Though she had not delivered it to any of them directly, the answer had delivered itself, in the way that the truth of a buried thing delivers itself when the right hand opens the seal. The cannon stood in front of the smithy for many years after that. long after Clara Finch had expanded her work to include commissions from mining operations in 3 adjacent counties, long after Burl Marsh had retired from the county office and Preston Cole had moved his practice to Denver, long after Ezekiel Haar had died in his stone cabin on the ridge and been buried there, at his request, with a view of the Teller Creek watershed. The cannon stood there, solid and restored and catching the high Colorado light on its polished bronze barrel, and the people of Ridgecrest walked past it most days without giving it particular thought, which is what happens to things that have been made to last. What they had forgotten, if they had ever known it, was that the cannon had been sealed for 15 years with a truth inside it that changed everything. What Clara Finch knew, and kept knowing, was that some things hold what they are given, and hold it faithfully, for as long as it takes the right person to arrive and open them. If something in this story stays with you, tell us what it was. And if you want another story about a woman who looked at what the world threw away and found what no one else could see, there is one waiting for you.